My best friend slept with my fiancé the night before our wedding. 5 years later, he's begging me to be his best man. The morning of what was supposed to be the happiest day of my life started with a text message that shattered everything I thought I knew about the people closest to me. I was sitting in my childhood bedroom at my parents' house putting on my wedding dress when my phone buzzed. It was from my maid of honor, and all it said was that I needed to see something before the ceremony. She showed up at my door 20 minutes later with her laptop, her face pale and her hands shaking. On the screen was a video that someone had posted on social media the night before, a recording from the bachelor party that my fiancé and his best friend had thrown together. The video was shaky and dark, but clear enough to see my fiancé and his best friend stumbling into a hotel room together, kissing and fumbling with each other's clothes. I watched in complete silence as the two men I trusted most in the world betrayed me in the most intimate way possible. My maid of honor kept apologizing and asking if I was okay, but I couldn't speak. I couldn't even cry. I just sat there in my wedding dress, watching my entire future crumble on a laptop screen. The worst part wasn't even the cheating itself, it was realizing that this probably wasn't the first time. Looking back, there had been so many signs that I'd ignored or explained away. The way they looked at each other sometimes, the inside jokes I was never part of, the times they'd disappear together for hours and come back with vague explanations about running errands or getting drinks. My fiancé had been my first serious relationship. We'd met in college when I was 19 and he was 21, and I'd thought we were going to spend the rest of our lives together. His best friend had been part of our relationship from the very beginning. They'd known each other since childhood and he was always around. I'd considered him like a brother, someone who would always be part of our family. The three of us had done everything together for years. We'd gone on vacations, spent every holiday together, shared an apartment for 2 years after college. I'd helped him through his own breakups, celebrated his promotions at work, and listened to him complain about his dating life countless times. I'd never once suspected that he might have feelings for my fiancé or that my fiancé might have feelings for him. I called off the wedding that morning. I had to stand in front of 200 guests and explain that there wouldn't be a ceremony, that everyone should go home, that I was sorry they'd traveled and bought gifts and taken time off work for nothing. My parents were mortified, my grandmother kept asking what had happened, and my younger sister couldn't stop crying. My fiancé tried to talk to me afterward, but I refused to see him. His best friend came to my parents' house later that day, still wearing his groomsman suit, begging me to let him explain. I watched him through the window as he stood on the front porch for over an hour, occasionally knocking on the door and calling my name. I never answered. I moved out of the apartment I'd shared with my fiancé the next week. I packed my things while he was at work, leaving behind anything that reminded me of our relationship or the life we'd planned together. I even left the engagement ring on the kitchen counter with a note that just said I never wanted to see either of them again. Update 1. It's been about 6 months since I posted originally, and I wanted to update everyone on what's been happening. First, thank you to everyone who reached out with support and shared their own stories. It helped more than you know to feel like I wasn't completely alone in this. I ended up moving back to my hometown, which I'd sworn I'd never do after college. My parents were incredible through everything. They helped me find a small apartment, and my mom drove 3 hours every weekend for the first month just to make sure I was eating and getting out of bed. My dad, who's usually not great with emotional stuff, surprised me by taking time off work to help me move and set up my new place. The hardest part has been losing not just my fiancé, but also his best friend who I'd considered family for so many years. I keep finding myself wanting to text him about random things, funny memes, something that happened at work, or just when I'm having a bad day. It's weird how you don't realize how much someone is part of your daily life until they're suddenly gone. I've been throwing myself into work and trying to rebuild my social life from scratch. It's harder than I expected to make new friends in your mid-20s, especially when you're dealing with trust issues and feeling like everyone around you is coupled up. I joined a hiking group and started taking pottery classes, which sounds cheesy but has actually been really therapeutic. The pottery thing started because I needed something to do with my hands that would keep my mind occupied. There's something about working with clay that forces you to focus on the present moment instead of spiraling into thoughts about the past or anxiety about the future. I've made some truly awful bowls and mugs, but I've also met some interesting people who don't know anything about my history and just accept me as I am now. My ex-fiancé has tried to contact me several times. He sent flowers to my work, left voicemails that I deleted without listening to, and even showed up at my parents' house once. My dad answered the door that time and apparently had some choice words for him because he hasn't tried that again. I changed my phone number after the voicemails started getting more frequent and desperate. His best friend has been quieter but more persistent in a way. He doesn't call or text, but I know he's been asking mutual friends about me. A few people have mentioned that he's been struggling with what happened and wants to apologize, but I'm not ready to hear it. I don't know if I'll ever be ready. The worst part is that I miss the friendship we had before everything fell apart. I miss having someone who knew me so well, who I could call when I was having a panic attack at work or when something funny happened that only he would understand. But I also know that friendship was built on a lie, or at least on him hiding huge parts of himself from me. I've been thinking a lot about whether I should have seen this coming. There were definitely moments that make more sense now, times when I'd walk into a room and they'd stop talking, or when one of them would make a comment that seemed loaded with meaning I didn't understand. But I also don't want to spend the rest of my life second-guessing every relationship and looking for signs of betrayal that might not be there. Some days are better than others. I have good days where I feel like I'm building something new and exciting for myself, and then I have days where I can barely get out of bed because the loneliness feels overwhelming. The hardest times are usually weekend mornings because that's when we use to make breakfast together and plan our day. I've started going to farmers markets on Saturday mornings just to have somewhere to be. I'm not dating yet, and I don't know when I will be. The idea of trusting someone enough to be vulnerable with them again feels impossible right now. I went on one coffee date that a coworker set up, and I spent the entire time analyzing everything the guy said for hidden meanings or signs that he wasn't being honest with me. It wasn't fair to him, and it wasn't fun for me. But I'm starting to feel like myself again in small ways. I bought plants for my apartment and actually managed to keep them alive. I signed up for a weekend trip with the hiking group to a national park I've never been to. I even went to my cousin's wedding last month, which was the first wedding I'd been to since my own non-wedding, and I didn't have a panic attack. Update 2. It's been almost 2 years since my original post, and I wanted to share what's been happening because my life has taken some turns I never expected. First, the update everyone's probably wondering about. I did eventually hear from my ex-fiancé's best friend again, but not in the way I thought I would. About 8 months ago, I got a call from the hospital. He'd been in a serious car accident and had listed me as his emergency contact, apparently because he'd never updated his information after we stopped speaking. I was shocked that I was still listed, but also that no one else in his family had been contacted first. The nurse explained that he'd been unconscious for several days and they weren't sure when he'd wake up. I almost didn't go to the hospital. I sat in my car in the parking lot for over an hour, trying to decide if I could handle seeing him after everything that had happened. But eventually I realized that regardless of how our friendship ended, I couldn't live with myself if something happened to him and I wasn't there. When I walked into his hospital room, I barely recognized him. He was hooked up to machines and looked so much smaller than I remembered. His sister was there. We'd met a few times over the years but didn't know each other well. She explained that he'd been struggling with depression and had been drinking heavily for months before the accident. She thought he might have been drinking the night he crashed, though the police report was inconclusive. Hearing about his depression hit me harder than I expected. Part of me felt guilty for cutting him out of my life so completely, even though I knew I'd needed to protect myself. But another part of me was angry that he'd been self-destructive instead of dealing with what had happened between us like an adult. He woke up 3 days later while I was sitting in the waiting room. His sister came out and said he was asking for me, but I wasn't sure I was ready to face him. When I finally went into his room, the first thing he did was apologize. Not just for what happened with my fiancée, but for everything, for hiding who he was, for letting me plan a wedding to someone who wasn't completely honest with me, for disappearing from my life without explanation. The conversation was awkward and painful, but also necessary. He told me that he'd been in love with my fiancée since they were teenagers, but had never acted on it because he was scared and confused about his sexuality. He said watching me and my fiancée together for all those years had been torture, but he'd convinced himself that being close to us was better than losing us completely. He explained that the night before the wedding, my fiancée had come to him drunk and emotional, saying he wasn't sure he could go through with the marriage. One thing led to another, and they ended up sleeping together. He said it wasn't planned and that they both regretted it immediately, but the damage was already done. I believed him about it not being planned, but I was still angry that neither of them had told me the truth before I found out from a social media video. He said they'd talked about calling off the wedding themselves, but my fiancée had convinced him that it was better to pretend it never happened and move forward with the original plan. The whole conversation was emotionally exhausting, but it also gave me some closure I didn't know I needed. I'd spent almost 2 years wondering if there had been other times, if their entire friendship had been a lie, if I'd been completely naive about what was happening around me. Learning that it really had been a one-time thing, driven by panic and alcohol rather than an ongoing affair, somehow made it easier to process. But the biggest surprise came a few weeks later. My ex-fiancé showed up at my apartment unannounced, looking terrible and asking if we could talk. I almost didn't let him in, but something about the way he looked made me curious about what he had to say. He told me that seeing his best friend in the hospital had made him realize how much damage their secret had caused to everyone involved. He said he'd been seeing a therapist and had come to understand that he'd been struggling with his own sexuality for years but had been too scared to be honest about it, even with himself. The conversation was bizarre and uncomfortable, but also strangely healing. He apologized for dragging me into his confusion and for not being brave enough to figure himself out before proposing to me. He said he genuinely loved me and had thought that love would be enough to make him happy in a traditional marriage, but he'd been wrong. What shocked me most was when he told me that he and his best friend weren't together. After everything that had happened, after destroying my life and their friendship, they'd both been too scared and guilty to pursue what they'd apparently wanted all along. They'd barely spoken since the accident, and both of them were dealing with their own shame and regret separately. I found myself feeling sorry for both of them, which was not an emotion I'd expected to have. They'd hurt me deeply, but they'd also hurt themselves and each other by being too afraid to be honest about who they were. I started to understand that their betrayal wasn't really about me at all, it was about their own internal struggles that they'd been avoiding for years. I didn't forgive them that day, and I told my ex-fiancé that I probably never would completely. But I also told him that I hoped he'd find a way to be happy and honest with himself, even if that meant we could never be friends again. Update 3. I'm writing this final update because something happened recently that I never could have imagined when I first posted my story. It's been almost 5 years since my non-wedding, and my life has changed in ways I couldn't have predicted. First, the personal stuff. I did eventually start dating again, though it took a long time and a lot of small steps. I met someone through the hiking group about a year ago, and we've been taking things very slowly. She's patient with my trust issues and doesn't push me to share more than I'm comfortable with. Yes, I apparently had some figuring out to do about my own sexuality as well, which was an unexpected twist in my journey of self-discovery. Meeting her helped me understand something I'd been struggling with for years. I'd always felt like something was missing in my relationship with my ex-fiancé, but I'd attributed it to normal relationship issues or compatibility problems. Looking back, I think we were both trying to fit into roles that weren't natural for us, and neither of us had the self-awareness to recognize what was really going on. My girlfriend and I have talked about getting married eventually, but we're both in agreement that we want to take our time and make sure we're doing it for the right reasons. I've learned that rushing into major life decisions because it's what's expected of you is a recipe for disaster. But the real reason I'm writing this update is because of something that happened last month. I got a call from my ex-fiancé's best friend asking if we could meet for coffee. I almost said no automatically, but something in his voice made me curious. We met at a small cafe in my neighborhood, and he looked healthier than he had in years. He told me that he'd been in therapy for the past 3 years, working through his depression and his issues with honesty and self-acceptance. He said he'd gotten sober after the accident and had been taking his mental health seriously for the first time in his adult life. He looked different, more confident, and settled in a way I'd never seen before. Then he told me why he'd wanted to meet. He's getting married in 6 months to someone he met in group therapy. He said his fiancée knows everything about what happened between us, and they've both done a lot of work to make sure they're entering their relationship with complete honesty and trust. I was happy for him, genuinely happy in a way that surprised me. But then he said something that completely caught me off guard. He asked if I would consider being in his wedding party. Not as a maid of honor or even a bridesmaid, but as his best woman. He said that despite everything that had happened, I was still one of the most important people in his life, and he couldn't imagine getting married without me there. He said he understood if I said no, but he wanted me to know that the offer was genuine and came from a place of love and respect. I was speechless. After everything we'd been through, after years of no contact and all the pain and betrayal, he was asking me to be part of one of the most important days of his life. My first instinct was to say absolutely not, that he was crazy for even asking. But as I sat there looking at him, I realized that I wasn't angry anymore. I was hurt, and there would always be a part of me that felt betrayed by what happened. But I could also see that he'd genuinely changed and grown from the experience. He wasn't the same confused, scared person who had made such a devastating choice 5 years ago. I told him I needed time to think about it, and he said he understood. He gave me his therapist's contact information and said that if I decided I was interested, his therapist had offered to facilitate a session with all of us to work through any remaining issues or concerns. I've been thinking about it for weeks now, and I'm still not sure what I want to do. Part of me thinks it would be healing to be part of his new beginning, to show that people can move forward from even the most painful betrayals. But another part of me worries that I'm not as healed as I think I am, and that being in his wedding might reopen wounds I've worked hard to close. I talked to my girlfriend about it, and she said she'd support whatever decision I made. She also pointed out that the fact that I'm even considering it shows how much I've grown and healed over the past few years. The person I was right after the betrayal would never have been able to have a civil conversation with either of them, let alone consider being part of their wedding. I also talked to my parents about it, and my dad surprised me with his response. He said that forgiveness doesn't mean forgetting what happened or pretending it didn't hurt, but it does mean choosing not to let someone else's mistakes define your future. He said if I felt like being part of the wedding would bring me peace, then I should consider it seriously. My mom was more cautious. She reminded me that I don't owe him anything, regardless of how much he's changed or how sorry he is. She said that choosing not to be in his wedding wouldn't make me a bad person, and that protecting my own emotional well-being should always be my first priority. They're both right, which makes the decision even harder. I know that I've come a long way in my healing journey, but I also know that there are still days when I feel angry or sad about what happened. I don't want to make a decision based on wanting to prove how over it I am, only to find myself struggling emotionally when the day actually comes. But there's also a part of me that's curious about what it would feel like to be there for him in a positive way after everything we've been through. We were genuinely close friends for years before everything fell apart, and while that friendship can never be exactly what it was before, maybe it could become something different but still meaningful. I've decided to take him up on the offer to meet with his therapist. I think having a neutral party help us work through the remaining issues and concerns might give me the clarity I need to make a decision I won't regret. If nothing else, it might help me understand my own feelings better and give me some closure on this chapter of my life. Whatever I decide, I know that I'm making the choice from a place of strength rather than fear or anger. 5 years ago, I never would have imagined that I'd be in a position to even consider this question. The fact that I am shows me how much I've grown and how much my life has changed for the better. I used to think that the worst thing that could happen to someone was being betrayed by the people they trusted most. I still think it's one of the worst things, but I've also learned that it's possible to survive it and even thrive afterward. I'm not the same person I was 5 years ago, and in many ways, I'm grateful for that growth even though I wish it had come through less painful circumstances. I'm planning to make my final decision about the wedding after I meet with the therapist. Whatever I choose, I know it will be the right choice for me at this point in my life. And regardless of whether I stand by his side on his wedding day or not, I'm proud of both of us for finding ways to heal and move forward from something that could have destroyed us both. Looking back on everything that's happened, I can honestly say that while I wouldn't choose to go through it again, I'm grateful for who I've become because of it. I'm stronger, more self-aware, and more honest with myself and others than I ever was before. I've learned that love isn't enough if it's not built on truth and authenticity, and I've found a relationship that exemplifies those values. Most importantly, I've learned that forgiveness isn't something you do for other people, it's something you do for yourself. Whether or not I end up in his wedding, I've already forgiven both of them for what happened. Not because they deserve it, but because carrying that anger and hurt was holding me back from fully embracing the life I've built for myself. I never expected my story to end with me considering being in my ex-fiancé's best friend's wedding, but life has a way of surprising you. Sometimes the most unexpected endings are the most healing ones, and sometimes the people who hurt you the most can also teach you the most about yourself and what you're capable of surviving. I'll update one more time after I make my final decision, but for now, I'm content knowing that whatever happens, I'm approaching it from a place of wisdom and self-love rather than fear and anger. That feels like the real victory in all of this.